You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art Ed?
Try to slice it.
Who art is Mr. Wood art Ed me?
Good. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, weekly art history for all ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood. Today, I'm really excited. I'm getting to talk to two people who have been producing an amazing book that is really covering so many of my interests. Longtime listeners know I love modern art. Early 20th century stuff is like some of the stuff that made me fall in love with art to begin with. And this book, The Woman with 50 Faces, not only has like a list of some of the most prominent artists, including like Chagall and stuff like that, but also it's a bit of a caper, which I am always happy for. I love a good heist, a caper, a con, anything like that is right up my alley. So I was very excited when this one came across my desk. The Woman with 50 Faces is going to be hitting stores tomorrow, July 22nd, and joining me, I have Zach Pinson and Jonathan Lackman. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Pleasure.
Yeah, you're welcome. Really excited to be here.
So for listeners, The Woman with 50 Faces is about Maria Lani. How do you say her name?
I say Lani, but I suppose we don't actually know how she herself pronounced it.
Okay, fair enough. So I'm glad for once I feel like I'm not the only one struggling with pronunciation, because usually I'm just like butchering any names and the comments section is just so painful for me sometimes. But this book, it is amazing. Like, I'm going to be honest, I had never heard of this story before I saw your book. So thank you. I'm always excited when I learn about new stuff. But she commissioned her portrait from like dozens of different artists. Can you just walk us through a little bit? Like, how did you come across her story and how did it click for you? Like, I've got to write this book.
You're not alone in never having heard of her. Even many of the art historians I talked to have never heard of her. When I was studying for my art history PhD orals, I was just cramming book after book, and in a footnote of one of these books, surveying Paris between the wars, I found a little bit about this exhibition that ended up being mounted of all of the portraits that were made of her. And I was dumbfounded that I had never heard of her and that she was just this tiny little footnote. And so I was busy at the time, too busy to look into her story, but I kind of made a mental note. And then the next year when I was in Paris working on my dissertation, I was waiting for some books to be delivered. And the library was sometimes a bit slow in getting you the books that you wanted. And so I thought, okay, what else could I research while I'm waiting for these books to get here? And I'm like, oh, what about that crazy artist model who I found in that footnote? Maybe I could find out some more information about her. So that was how I got started down this path. And I had no idea what a long and winding path it would become, because I ended up searching not just in that library, but in libraries and archives all across Paris and in several other cities, trying to track down the story of this woman who it seemed nobody really knew much about. And everything that I read about her that I could find seemed to contradict the last thing that I read. So it really became, quite an art historical mystery. And there was the story she told about herself, and then there was the story that started to be told about her after she died. And the more I got into it, the more I realized that neither of those stories were actually true. And so the book is really about chasing down the real story as far as it can be ascertained and presenting it in a graphic novel form. And that's where Zach came in. So I did all the research and Zach did all of the art. And of course, the lines are never quite that distinct, but we can get into that later.
Okay, so just for listeners, that was Jonathan speaking. So you're studying for your PhD, and you come across this woman who seemed to have served as a model for a lot of artists, right? Like you keep seeing images of the same woman. Yeah. How did you start to figure out like there's something weird here? Because we've seen some models used a lot, but usually by like the same artist or sometimes a famous figure. But like, what started to trigger in your head these like alarm bells? Like, there's something a little different here.
Yeah, I mean, it's extremely unusual to find this many portraits by this many great artists. We're talking Matisse, Chagall, Soutine, Man Ray, Braque, Léger. I could just go on and on. And especially that many portraits done in a single year, and especially that many portraits done of a fairly ordinary citizen. We're not talking about like the king, or Napoleon or something. And what seems to have happened is that she showed up in Paris in 1928, silent film star from Berlin, and became the toast of the town, was being feted at all kinds of high society parties, and haute couture houses were pushing their clothes on her, and she was in all the newspapers and all the magazines, and stories started to get around that she was working on a movie, and that for this movie, which was about a fictional art collector, she needed lots of portraits that would appear in the sets for this movie all around this art collector's house. And so sort of dangling that lure of Hollywood stardom, she convinced all of these artists, practically every major artist in Paris at the time, except for Picasso, to do her portrait. And as far as I can tell, to do them for free. I mean, they weren't giving her the portraits, they were lending them to her for the purposes of the movie. And before that even got going, they were collected together in an exhibition, which went to New York, Chicago, Berlin, Rotterdam, and finally Paris, and London as well. And so that was basically how she got so many portraits done of her in such a short span of time. And then nobody really heard much from her after that. So by the mid-1930s, she was virtually unknown again. And finally, when she died in 1954, this new story started to emerge about her, that she had not been a silent film star from Berlin, but rather a con artist from Warsaw, and that she had made up this story about the movie in order to take these portraits and run off to America and sell them off to unsuspecting collectors and make a fortune. And turns out that story isn't really true either. I don't think so. I mean, it's true that she definitely exaggerated her resume and shaved 10 years off her age, and did all the kinds of, I would say, normal things that actors do, as they people in Hollywood do all the time, kind of inflating how far along a project really is and that sort of thing. But amazingly enough, she became such a phenomenon that the movie did actually start to get made. It was never completed, but Thomas Mann, the Nobel Prize winner, wrote a screenplay. Jean Renoir signed on to direct. Greta Garbo signed on to co-star. And then the project kind of fell apart after she died.
Okay, so wow, there's just like layer upon layer of con or misdirection there. It reminds me of the dude who sold the Eiffel Tower. It just like so much bonkers stuff happening there. That is absolutely fascinating. So how did she convince all of these people that like she was a star? I mean, I guess what I'm trying to picture is like today, if I walk up to anybody and I tell them like, no, trust me, I'm like a really big deal, they're going to be looking at me like I'm insane. It's so easy to be like, yeah, no one's ever heard of you. There's no paparazzi around. Like, how does she create those trappings to like really sell this illusion when she came to town?
I mean, it's frankly amazing that she pulled it off, because if you think about these artists at this time, I mean, this is the most cosmopolitan city in Europe. This is the kind of red heart center of the art world in a way that the art world has never been this concentrated since. And all of these artists kind of prided themselves on their ability to see through illusions, right? See down to the truth of people and essences and these kinds of things. And they were all fooled by her, most of them. And occasionally they would make little notes in their diary like, is this woman for real? I'm not sure. But they would still went along with it anyway. And she I mean, the irony is that all of these people, after she died, started saying, "Oh, she was no actress." But obviously, she was an amazing actress, right? Because
Clearly,
her acting may not have ever made it onto screen, but it sure did fool a whole lot of people. And yeah, she seems to have taken in Jean Cocteau first. And that was a very clever move because he was kind of the key to unlocking the rest of the Parisian art scene. He was very well connected. He knew everyone. And he seems to have played an early role in making introductions for her to various other people and kind of talking her up. And he ended up writing the catalog essay for her exhibition. And he was really her biggest defender throughout her life. And then when she died, he became her biggest detractor. That's a whole other story. He seems to have gotten embittered because of a lawsuit that her husband brought against him. Her husband had bought the rights to one of Cocteau's plays and then was dissatisfied with the fact that Cocteau was also sharing this play with other people. And so he sued Cocteau. And in the process, Cocteau may have learned a few things about her not actually being from Berlin and so on, and the fact that she had changed her name and changed her age. And he seems to have concluded in his bitterness that she was just a total fraud. And he seems to have been the one just to start spreading these rumors about her being a thief, although we can't say for sure. But yeah, the whole Cocteau subplot to this book is a really important and fascinating one. I mean, he's just such an amazing figure himself. His art, his film, his theater, he just did so much and knew everyone.
Well, and I guess that's interesting because a couple threads I'm noticing there. I mean, one, it makes perfect sense that somebody, upon coming to that painful realization that they've been had or they've been conned, they've been duped, like that gets you at a different level. And I can see where someone who put his own word, like his own reputation with her, would become very bitter. That makes sense to me. But the thing I find kind of interesting about that is it feels to me almost like the modernists, despite being so anti-establishment, I think of like, the modernists were pulling away from the Paris Salon and the official gatekeepers and stuff. They kind of had gatekeepers, Cocteau putting the stamp of approval. And if you're introduced by the right people, you get in with that circle and people stop questioning stuff. Like it feels like there's something kind of curious going on there. Or is that just me?
No, I think you're onto something. I think, in every subculture, there are certain people who are the gatekeepers, who are the connectors. There was some sociology book that came out a few years ago kind of about these influencers, right? Before we talked about influencers in the social media sense, there were these studies of people who just seemed to know everyone and were kind of sort of the key to various trends taking root in various communities. And yeah, he seems to have been one of those kinds of people in his day. So
now, if I can shift a little bit, because, the story here is fascinating, but it's also an arts podcast. So can we talk a little bit about these portraits that were created? Like you said that these were created as essentially like set pieces for a film that was almost produced or was on the way to being produced. Can you tell us a little bit about like what did these pieces look like? And like were there common themes in the way that she was portrayed in these? Like how did the portraits, or how would they fit in with this supposed film?
I'll give a little bit of an answer, and then I'd love to hear what Zach has to say from artist perspective. I mean, this is a time in Paris where you really have a tremendous number of artistic styles overlapping. We have this tendency to think of art history as like, for these 5 years we had this style, and then for the next 5 years we had that style. But when in truth, in a moment like 1928, you can find Bonnard still doing post-impressionism that he was doing in the 1890s. You can find cubists at work, like Braque. You find fauvism. You find surrealism. You find so many different styles, and indeed that's what you see in these portraits. There's just a breathtaking array of different approaches to the very idea of a portrait. I mean, with Man Ray, right, who was a photographer, you almost have like a proto-pop approach to the idea of a portrait. And so you can see that they went into the task with very different approach. And then you also get the impression in reading about the sessions that she really went into it with this idea that she was going to be a different person for every artist and bring out a different side of herself and get a different portrait out of them. She, I think, was really very much a collaborator in these sessions and deserves credit as a kind of impresario of this grand experiment, right, where the subject stays the same, so, sort of, and all the artists change, and so you get to see their personality, but you also have to take into account the fact that she was changing from session to session, and it's this amazing record of just the flux that she was able to bring about. How about you, Zach? How do you feel about the portraits?
Yeah, I think it just kind of shows all the different temperaments of each artist, and all these artists were kind of in their, would you say they're at their peak maybe? Because I mean, they all were just they had like sincerity of their line. They just were very confident in what they showed on paper. I don't know. It's so hard.
I think you're really onto something there. Like if you take an artist like Suzanne Valadon, who not very many people have heard of, she produced this amazing portrait. I really feel like it's one of the best works I've ever seen. I had a chance to see this portrait at a show in Italy a few years ago, and it's incredible. One of my absolute favorite portraits of Maria. And in general, yeah, I think the quality of the works is pretty high across the board. Artists seem to have. She brought out something in most of them that.
Yeah. It was such a hot zone for like experimentalists. And yeah, I look at like John Cocteau, and I never learned of John Cocteau until you and I met, John. Like in all my art history classes and stuff, they never talked about John Cocteau, and I look at him and I was like, it might have been one of the most important experimental artists of that time, and it is interesting, how this book even puts all these artists that myself and I'm sure a lot of American students and fans of art have maybe never come across. I don't know, Kyle, did you know much of John Cocteau?
No, not that one specifically.
Yeah.
I mean, looking at this, you've got over 50 artists, but some of the big names, heavy hitters that most of the audience would recognize, people like Derain, Matisse, we've got Soutine, we've got like a lot of artists, Man Ray also. Like when we think about all of those artists in the late 1920s going into the 30s, those were that was like the peak of their mature phase. Like this wasn't right when Matisse was starting to dabble in paint fresh out of the tube. Like he'd been doing this for a while. He was confident in what he was doing, as was, Derain, Marac, like all of these people, like they had made it, they had established themselves and their style. And so like, I just imagine this would be such an amazing exhibition to go to as someone who loves art history. And what I love about that time is it was so experimental. It was so much about trying out like, okay, what if we flatten these shapes? What if we build these textures? What if we put on this heavy impasto? What if we explore the expressive qualities more instead of the representational nature of like what's in front of us? Like there's so much happening, and the surrealism and the Dadaists, like all of that coming together, and to see one common subject in 50 different styles by artists at the top of their game, like that had to be an amazing collection.
Mm.
Is that collection documented anywhere that we can see it?
I mean, the works at this point are spread across the globe. I mean, I would love for someone to bring them together for a reunion exhibition. I've tracked down as many of them as I can. Some of them are surely in private hands or even lost. Certain ones I've never managed to find. You can see a few of them if you wander around the northeast of the U.S. There's some in New York, D.C., one in Western Massachusetts, etc. And then most of the rest that I've found are in Europe. Yeah, unfortunately, there's no one place to go to see a lot of them, except in reproduction. And there was a catalog made in black and white, and that's a great place to see a lot of them. And then, you can find images of a lot of them on the web, but certainly not all of them. I have a huge collection of them on my hard drive, and I am writing a blog about the book and about the making of the book. And eventually I'll get all of my research up there, including all of the images I have of all the known artworks. It's still in process right now, but I'm rolling that out over time.
And listeners, I'm going to put a link in the show notes so you can see and read the blog as it's developing and as it comes live. But right now we're going to take a short break. And then when we come back, I want to get more into the book and the creative process that went into this piece, because it's an interesting story, but you're telling it in a very visually forward way, and I want to get into that as well. I'm back with Zach Pinson and Jonathan Lackman. Their new book, The Woman with 50 Faces, is coming out tomorrow if you're listening the day this is dropping. But head on out to your favorite bookseller, get a copy of it. If you don't want to leave your house, you can, of course, check links in the show notes. But it's a fascinating story about a woman who effectively conned dozens of artists in the mid-20th century, dozens of great artists, and got them to paint her portrait and make it in different ways. But you guys made a graphic novel telling this story. And I am curious, Zach, I'm going to put you on the spot here because you're the visual man behind this. The first question I have as a visual artist, admittedly not of your skill level, was it a little intimidating trying to tackle this subject where you've got like a murderer's row of artists here and art history being referenced, and you're trying to depict all of this and, come up with your own style, your own take on this story and the natural comparison to the work that you have to look at as you're doing it?
I don't, it made me excited. I love all styles of art. I'm not particular in any way. And like, I still feel like I experiment myself with my own style. I get bored with myself very easily. I thought this was a great story to tackle. I typically would never collaborate ever, because when I get obsessed with projects, like I will put hundreds of hours into it. And so like collaborating, it's always like, it makes me scared of like just veering off from what I typically want to do. But John, he was sitting on this amazing story, and the subject matter, we're trying to portray her whole life on top of representing a lot of the exciting times in Paris, World War II, and then, how it all kind of fell apart. I don't know. It was exciting. I love all styles of art, and I was like, this could be a very fun project and a challenge.
Well, I'm thinking specifically, like, as I'm looking through your book, I see there's in the background of a panel, maybe Picasso or something like that. Do you feel like a little bit weird, like, because you've got to mimic an artist's style for the what's happening in the negative space, but then, it's also your vision and your style coming through in all of, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, like it's weird, like how I think of the story and stuff. It's like I'm really not holding back in any way or like trying to conform to anything, or I try to resist conforming to anything. And yeah, I just go where my mind's eye goes, if that makes any sense. Like when someone's telling you a story, yeah, I just visualize it in a very specific way. And that's kind of all I do. I just kind of start drawing where my mind's eye goes. And I don't really hold back, or I try not to feel embarrassed, or I've been drawing, I don't know, since I in third grade, I was winning some art prizes and stuff. So it was kind of in my blood.
I guess this is where you and I are very different artists. You're mature and talented, whereas I was born with, I would consider it a heroic lack of talent, and I have learned through brute force. Like my skill is more the analytical. So I'm sitting here thinking like I take a very systematic approach to everything, and that's how I make sense of everything. I'm a bit of a formalist. I'm breaking stuff down and seeing like, okay, I see this type of line, I see this type of shape, and this signifies, whatever to me. Can I talk to you guys about like, and maybe this is just my like systematic approach, trying to understand the operations. How did you guys come to this? Like, was there a draft of, okay, here's the story we're telling, and then, we need these panels and like the page layouts, and that like, what were the steps involved in the back and forth between the two of you as you were developing this book?
Maybe I'll jump in. By the time I decided that this story would really work best as a graphic novel, as opposed to more standard kind of nonfiction book, I had a lot of the research in hand, and basically, all of the broad outlines of her story. So it was already kind of broken down into chapters, and when Zach and I started working together, I said, I want to give you kind of the broad outline that I have in mind and all of my research, but then I really want you to take over and have the creative freedom to break each scene down into panels the way that you envision it working most successfully artistically. Because I really didn't want it to be like my ideas illustrated. I wanted each page to be its own work of art that someone would want to look at just forever for its own sake. And I saw that potential in Zach's art when I first found it, when my wife, Alex Hart, found it and showed it to me. And so, I really wanted to give him as much creative freedom as possible. So we had conversations, certainly, about, how to break things down, and, and I mean, there were so many parts of her life that could have been like 100 pages by themselves. So we had to be parsimonious and say, okay, we're just going to devote 10 pages to this year or whatever, or this set of years. And once we had that set up, Zach would go ahead and do sketches. He would kind of decide, okay, how many panels are we going to have on this page? And roughly speaking, what's going to happen in each panel. And then we would have a conversation. Occasionally I would have some notes like, oh, we also really need to squeeze in this detail or something. And then he would go into the inking process, which was a very lengthy process because his style, which is amazing, requires lots and lots of individual strokes to get a lot of shading and so on. We estimated in the end that there are probably about 500,000 pen strokes in the book. And so
it's a lot of hatching there.
Maybe we could make a proposal to the Guinness Book of World Records.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at most graphic novels, right, they're done often on an iPad or whatever, and they're done much more quickly and generatively. And Zach's approach is much more old school and laborious, but I think it really produced a graphic novel that doesn't look or feel like any other graphic novel out there. And that, to me, is what's so exciting about it.
And can we take a moment, Zach? Can you tell us the steps? It's an old school method. Like, I look at this, it looks and feels like a hand drawn, pen and ink cross hatching, or not really cross hatching. It looks like straight hatching for the most part. But that's a thing that you and I and like nobody else will care about. But let's see now. Do I see stippling in here? But
I call it like a wash, like of marks.
So can you just tell the listeners, like, how did you create this? And also, like, I'm just envisioning I could spend a year and not complete this many drawings. Like, how long was this taking for you? So the steps and how long?
It was on and off about 10 years. And yeah, I don't really, I think I'm just maybe an obsessive person or like some OCD thing or whatever, but like, I just like, I really like building up and modeling the figure in this old, I don't know, draftsman way. I have done printmaking in the past, and I really got into this style doing intaglio printmaking, which, I mean, you're working on a copper plate and you're making lines with a needle or a nail. And yeah, I just feel like that's the right way to do things. And I never could get into this more flat style. It just always felt like I was taking shortcuts or cheapening myself. And yeah, I just don't understand why more people don't do this. Well, I do understand because
it's hard. That's why. For listeners not familiar with intaglio, you referenced that style. You said you etched it into a copper plate with like a needle or something like that. The way that process works, you etch the design into the surface and then you ink it. Ink goes into the etched areas, wipe off the excess ink, and then a paper gets pressed to that. It's a very old traditional printmaking method. Very similar to like the old wood block prints and stuff like that, just a thinner plate. Can we get into the mechanics? Are you just straight pen and ink making the illustration? Are you penciling first, inking, like just basic level? Because I have the mind of a 5-year-old. How did you do this?
Yeah, well, first, I would make little thumbnails, sometime on paper, sometime on the iPad, and it would just be little thumbnails of like where the page is going. It kind of covered just the broad strokes, so John could understand how everything's laid out. And I would have little notes on the side of each panel of what people were saying or doing. And then I would take those little thumbnails and start penciling it. But I really wouldn't spend too much time penciling. I would just cover the basic shapes. And then I would just immediately start inking. And I know like sometimes it's just dangerous doing it this way because if you didn't plan your page right, you're going to have like weird faces or hands or some details. But I kind of like leaving those in. I like imperfections, and I don't like the 100% polished look of things. I like it a little rough. So yeah, and I think it adds to the more experimental type approach to this project and to the story.
Yeah, those slight rough marks are part of the charm of handmade work. I mean, it shows the humanity in the process, and I love that. And I also love your response that I think I'm going to have to clip to use in my classroom, because I heard you say that at the start, you made thumbnail sketches, you planned it in pencil, made a rough draft, and then you inked it and made it permanent. And you recognized the risks you were taking along the way at different stages, and you thought it all through. And for so many of my students, they need to hear that. And I know other art students across the country do too. So I'm going to be clipping that and sharing it with all my teacher friends. So thank you for a smooth, coherent explanation of the artistic process.
Yeah, I think like I also play guitar and stuff, and I just think like making anything creative or whatever, like when you've been doing it for a long time, you do get in this weird zone of like, I'm going to purposely, risk myself in certain parts of this work, or maybe I'll fall flat on my face, or maybe it'll work out in the end. And then even if it's not perfect, generally people just really like to see something that's a little embarrassing, or I don't know. Like I could show you like a handful of the hands I drew, and they're not perfect, but I don't know. I think something's charming when it's off a little bit.
No, I fully agree. If I'm going to be like pretentious about it, I might use terms like sprezzatura for that, studied carelessness. But I think there's a point where like you got to think, you got to plan, but then the training wheels have to come off, and you approach it differently when you can't erase the mark, that you have to live with the mark that you made, and you revise and you reflect and you work from there. But I love everything you said about that working process. Like I said, that's the way I like to hear somebody is creating their stuff. And this book is full of gorgeous illustrations. The page layouts they're nicely balanced. There's just the way that each panel works independently, but then they work together as well. It's nice. It's like, as just a reader, it's nice to look at and thumb through. I like the way it all came together. Now, after one last short break, I want to get into final thoughts on this, because we've covered so much ground on here. I'm back once again with Jonathan Lackman and Zach Pinson talking about their new book, The Woman with 50 Faces. Get it wherever you get your books. And the first question I have before we wrap this up, just Jonathan, you said you spent a long time researching, chasing down all this information. You had pages and pages and pages of notes. How did you come to the conclusion that this would be best served in a graphic format compared to a traditional historical book?
So by the time I came to her story half a century after she died, there was no one around for me to talk to who knew her. And although she was writing a memoir when she died, that memoir has been lost. And she and her husband had no children. So it was a very difficult task to dig up enough information about her to tell her story. And despite my best efforts, there were still holes in the story. And that, combined with the fact that I just didn't really have enough material to fill a full nonfiction book about her. And I didn't want to just pad out a book with like historical context and whatnot, which I thought would just dilute her story. I was really looking for an alternative way of telling the story that would use all the research that I had found, but also bring it to life and give you that kind of full-length book experience. And at that time, I happened to read one of the first graphic novels I ever read was Logic Comics, a nonfiction graphic novel about the history of the philosophy of mathematics. Doesn't exactly sound like the most promising topic for an engrossing graphic novel, but I was absolutely spellbound by it. And I thought, wow, if they can turn this into a graphic novel, really anything can be a graphic novel. And I'll admit I had kind of prejudices up until this point about graphic novel being a kind of narrow genre, not really suited to this kind of story. But that really opened my eyes. And so I started to look for an illustrator, and it did take a few years. But I feel like the graphic novel really turned out to be the perfect medium for this, not only because it's a very visual story, but because there are these mysteries still around her. And Zach was really able to turn those mysteries into something beautiful as opposed to something kind of unsatisfying and like a glaring hole. And also the graphic novel just really, I feel like in Zach's hands, really became a way of expressing the incredible array of emotions that she experienced throughout her life. I mean, we haven't even talked about the fact that she was Jewish and she ended up having to flee Paris when Hitler invaded, and she saved a large number of other Jews in the process of escaping from Europe. And her story is just so outlandish and wild that in a way it needed something like the graphic novel to really do it justice.
That makes sense. And, it is a wild story, and there are so many different avenues to explore and so many different facets to it. Just to wrap this up, like, if you're telling listeners about Maria Lani, that's the pronunciation I'm going with, Maria Lani. If you're telling readers about her, what do you want people to take away from this book? What do you want them to remember about her story? Where's the significance for you? Why is this a story worth telling?
I think her accomplishment in getting all of these portraits made and having them become an exhibition and a book and just a cultural phenomenon, it really was a moment where the artist model kind of flipped the usual script in art history, right? We think of artists being the creative geniuses, and the models are just putty in their hands. They're just the tools that they use to get to the vision that they have. But the more you learn about her and the more you read about her and the more you look at the portraits that were made, the more you realize that she must have had an important role in how those portraits turned out. And just in the fact that this amazing exhibition came about, this experiment that has never been repeated before or since. It's an extraordinary accomplishment that I feel like she doesn't get enough credit for, largely because artist models in general are kind of dismissed and not paid attention to. And that's, again, something that really deserves to change and has come about for certain kinds of, understandable historical sexist reasons. But in this day and age, we really should be giving a lot of them a closer look.
Yeah, that is a fair point and an interesting insight. I'm kind of ashamed to say I hadn't considered all that much myself, but yeah, this book does certainly bring that to the fore. Zach, what about you? What's your main takeaway? What do you get out of this experience, this story? What do you want our listeners to see and appreciate, understand about the work?
I got the main theme I was identifying with was identity. And yeah, like how I think identity, you can discover it, you can lose it, you can find it again, you can lose it again. And, and then all of a sudden John could pick it up somewhere. I think, especially like this day and age with everyone trying to figure themselves out on the internet and everywhere else. I think it has a strong theme about identity in it that I think is very fascinating.
Yeah, there is something really interesting about the way that she carried herself and portrayed herself and built up this narrative and this identity that captivated people, and then it was lost. And, but also in the fact that with all of that, she also, as Jonathan said, she ended up saving a number of people during World War II and pulling them out. And again, sadly tied to people's perceptions of identity with that and the Holocaust and everything like that. And now I'm trying to find a way to wrap this up that's not a total downer, because I just started talking about World War II. So I'm going to do the totally shallow thing and say, at least on a positive, I'm seeing and appreciating the charm of handmade work, and these drawings, these illustrations are gorgeous. And as a less accomplished artist, I 100% know how much time and effort must have gone into making all of these drawings. And I applaud you, because that time was well spent. The book is gorgeous. And listeners, if you want to get a copy, The Woman with 50 Faces is hitting bookstores July 22nd, or check the links in the show notes. But once again, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate your sharing your insights, Zach Pinson and Jonathan Lackman.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.